How can Africa pay for a climate-positive future? African leaders want sweeping changes to the global financial system to help the continent adapt to the effects of extreme weather. At the first ever African Climate Summit in the Kenya capital, Nairobi, discussions with the private sector and civil society focused on raising funds to help adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. Expectations were high, as DW's Mariel Muller reports.
My expectation is that an African position that will deliver climate finance, climate justice, and a strong agenda for COP28.
My hope is that, we come up strong with one voice, so we are able, for example, to secure the resources that are needed for climate adaptation. We are able as well to position ourselves as leaders, in the climate discourse.
I hope to see more youth engagements and in conversations in matters climate change adaptation and mitigation.
It was the first climate summit to primarily focus on the African continent. Africa is most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, but only receives about 12% of the annual financing it needs to cope.
What we're seeing is that the shocks are more frequent and the scale and the severity of them is increased. How are the populations going to be able to build their own resilience to address these shocks? And it's work that needs to start now.
But African leaders at this summit were eager to cast the continent not as a victim, but a long-ignored ally in the fight against global warming.
The continent has enough potential to be entirely self-sufficient with the mixture of wind, solar, geothermal, sustainable biomass, and hydropower. In Africa, we can be a green industrial hub that helps other regions achieve their net zero strategies by 2050.
African heads of state unanimously adopted a declaration that called for a carbon tax on fossil fuels, debt relief measures, and a reform of the global financial system to unblock large-scale investments in clean energy. African countries struck climate-related financing deals worth $23 billion as a result of the summit. The United Arab Emirates, for example, which will host the COP28 climate conference this November, pledged $4.5 billion alone, $450 million in carbon credits. Many consider this a success, but there are critics. Orieni Japheth, a climate justice advocate, says carbon credits are just a pretext for big polluters to keep emitting carbon dioxide.
For global north corporations, the carbon market is a way of washing their hands clean, like we are doing something. This is our corporate social responsibility and all that. No, it cannot work like that. If there is a fossil fuel investment that is coming here in Africa, we must be on the table.
Together with hundreds of other climate activists, he took to Nairobi streets protesting the summit's agenda. They say it pushed primarily pro-Western interests.
We need action. We need action, and most African youth feel frustrated that there is very little action in this space. And so and there's that anxiety, you see. People are like, what kind of planet will we leave for our kids?
That's the big open question heading into the COP28 summit. Will the ideas of young Africans be listened to and taken seriously?
Okay, joining the conversation from Nairobi is the climate justice campaigner Eric Njuguna. Welcome back to DW News Africa, Eric. Now, does the Nairobi Declaration resonate with the concerns of local communities and the civil society?
No, it doesn't. We expected a strong commitment from African leaders on phasing out fossil fuels, but from the Nairobi Declaration, we had language around phasing down coal, which is a stab in the back to communities who are affected by the impacts of the fossil fuel industry from Uganda, where there's a Stop ACOP, and the project is literally displacing thousands of people in the community, from Nigeria who have been affected by the impacts of Shell. And overall, the Africa Climate Summit was a summit of a festival of false solutions. There was a huge Western and corporate push for false solutions like carbon markets, which give global North countries and corporates a ticket to pollute, while they offset the emissions, and impedes our ability to strongly cut down emissions, to be able to limit a global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And having realized this, that is why African peoples organized an alternative summit that ran parallel to the African Climate Summit to give African people's demands and priorities the center stage.
The declaration emphasizes the urgency of reducing emissions, but this is not as easy for some countries as it is for others. For example, Kenya has geothermal energy, many other countries don't. How do you think this need for the reduction of emissions can be balanced with the need for economic growth and job creation?
I've heard that question a lot, and I don't see why it's posed as a dilemma. It doesn't have to be either or. We can develop sustainably while it's providing jobs for millions and even access to renewable energy for the millions who don't have access to electricity. It doesn't have to be either or, because the development pathways pushed on us by the global North, which are both carbon intensive and extractive, don't have the same pathways that we African countries are following. We can indeed be able to develop sustainably using renewable energy while it's creating jobs for millions of people on the African continent, and also meeting Africa's energy demand.
There is a lot of much emphasis on the critical role for preparing for the impact of climate change as well as managing that impact. Considering you've personally seen firsthand the devastating effects of extreme weather in Kenya, how can vulnerable communities be better equipped to face the impact of climate change?
So right now there is a huge gap in adaptation finance. Large communities who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And that is why even during the African Climate Summit, we were calling for African countries to call for more finance from global North countries to support communities on the front lines of the climate crisis with adaptation finance, so that they're able to build resilience in the face of the climate crisis. But also, when we carry out adaptation projects, we need to make sure that equity and justice are the heart of our work, so that we are not creating or replicating the same systems, the same injustices that lead to maladaptation. Secondly, we also need finance to support communities who are not past the stage of adapting and need loss and damage finance, because multiple communities are losing their own lives and livelihoods, and they need reparations from global North countries.
So at these different summits, at COP and these gatherings, we tend to see the power imbalance emphasized between what you have with the wealthier countries versus, for example, the Africans and the so-called global South. What can be done, you know, as you're talking about a call for justice, how can that happen whilst this power imbalance still exists?
Exactly. And that is what we hoped the African Climate Summit will deliver, a common position on that meets Africa's energy demands. But what we saw was Western influence and impeded our own ability to build a Pan-African solidarity and push our own agenda. But even at COP, right, there is a huge power imbalance. And one thing we need to do is create a conflict of interest policy, because there is huge influence even from corporates and especially the fossil fuel industry in these discussions, meaning that the mosquito is leading the fight against malaria. And so one thing is that we need a conflict of interest policy, but also the other thing is we need to support the participation of vulnerable communities so that their voices are truly heard in these spaces.
Eric, COP28 is coming up in a few months. What would you want the global leaders and financial institutions to prioritize in their discussions?
The litmus test for whether COP28 will be successful or not is whether we're going to have strong commitment, especially from global north countries, in phasing out fossil fuels. And that is why we call on all countries to endorse a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and commit to moving away from fossil fuels. Secondly, I think there needs to be support, especially from global north countries, in supporting a loss and damage finance facility to support communities who have lost their lives and livelihoods as a result of the climate crisis. We also need to reject false solutions, because at COP28, false solutions, especially through Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, are getting the center stage. And that is why at COP28, we need to reject carbon markets, we need to reject carbon capture and storage, we need to reject geoengineering, and reset our agenda to focus on real solutions that are just and equitable, so that they benefit communities, especially those on the front lines of the climate crisis that are disproportionately affected.
All right, Eric Njuguna, climate justice campaigner, thank you for speaking to us. Now, Kenya's green energy future would seem to be well in sight. The country already generates most of its power from renewables and wants to go all the way by the end of the decade. But despite being able to harness the power of the wind, water and sun, it's still struggling to maintain a constant energy supply.
This farmer put solar panels on his roof less than 2 years ago. For him, like many others here, getting power from the sun is a lifesaver. But he's turned to his own supply because it's cheaper and more reliable than Kenya's national grid.
The other day, there was a complete blackout for 2 days. Most of my village mates did not have water because they rely on the electric pumps. I had water throughout.
30 years ago, few Kenyans had access to electricity. Today, around 3/4 of the population has power. That's tens of millions of people. 90% of the country's energy already comes from renewables like wind and solar. With its big hitter, geothermal energy making up 45% of Kenya's total power production. The Olkaria geothermal power station northeast of Nairobi sits at the heart of the country's renewable crown. But meeting energy demands requires more than just a plentiful supply of hot steam.
One of the larger problems is also upgrading the existing infrastructure because it was not designed for renewable energy generation. And so I think there needs to be huge investment to make a 100% renewable energy future possible.
And that is Kenya's dream, to go 100% renewable by 2030. But it can't afford to upgrade its energy infrastructure without more investment. And that's why the country has led calls for a fairer system to help African nations access the funds they need.
Let's bring in Samaila Zubeiru, President and CEO at Africa Finance Corporation. Thank you for joining us on the program. And now you're just back from the summit in Nairobi. Climate finance was a key topic there. Can you tell us about the AFC's involvement in climate financing?
Thank you very much for having me. So we've been very involved in climate finance, from the very beginning. We've identified renewable energy as a very significant growth area. And in fact, green economy as a path for growth for Africa. So we hope to inaugurate our third wind farm soon that will provide almost all the energy requirements of Djibouti, replacing imported fuel and energy from Ethiopia, as well as fossil fuel generating plants. Africa has 60% of the world's best solar sources, and we are tapping on that. Africa has significant wind resources. Africa has significant hydro resources. And Africa also has the path, for carbon neutral industrialization. So we have the first certified carbon neutral industrial zone in Gabon. And we think that with the renewable energy that we generated in Djibouti, we can build another carbon neutral industrial zone in Djibouti as well, bearing in mind its proximity and in a major transit route for most of international shipping. In fact, 30% of maritime traffic goes through Djibouti. So it makes sense for that to be a transshipment hub. And with the green energy that we generate, we can build green ammonia, and we can have green fuels for the ships as they pass through that route. So this is something that we've been very passionate about. We built the first wind farm in Cape Verde, and now we're building the first wind farm in Djibouti. Putting there, and demonstrating the importance of public-private partnership, the importance of blended finance, the importance of collaboration with several partners to make projects come to life in Africa.
Djibouti is on course to, at least the hope is that it can become fully dependent on renewable energy. How easy is it to replicate such projects elsewhere on the continent?
So, it depends on the commitment of the government. I think maybe a good way to understand the replicability is to tell you a bit more about what we did in Djibouti. So in Djibouti, we partnered with Greenhorn Investments, which is a state entity. We provided the development capital to de-risk the opportunity. And part of that was negotiating a public-private power purchase agreement with the government. On the back of that, we got a World Bank guarantee of government's obligation in the power purchase agreement. So that essentially guaranteed the cash flows from the power plant. And then we introduced construction finance, an equity bridge to accelerate the development and construction of the project in a way that we would reduce the completion and construction risk associated with project finance in Africa. And especially because we were developing the plant during COVID. COVID disrupted the program. We didn't want to start, a conversation with lenders around the financial close for a project at a time like that, in a location like that. So we put in place equity bridge that allowed us to construct the plant. We actually worked with Siemens in Germany, to build that plant. So that is a very good positive, and it shows the power of partnerships, collaborating with various partners across the world to deliver renewable energy in Africa. Right. So clearly this is something that can be replicated.
Right. Projects like that are major infrastructural developments on a national level, but how do we bring in the sort of small-scale local level to avoid them being left behind, so that financing is not just focusing on sort of these massive projects?
So this is scalable. This is a 60 megawatt power plant. We hope to increase that. Actually, we've agreed to increase it to 105 with an expansion of 45 megawatts. And there is scope, to do, go to as high as 300 megawatts. The challenge is that the smaller the projects are, the more complicated they are, because you have to go through the same process. So cost-benefit analysis becomes, challenging if you're doing projects below 50 megawatts in the first instance. But if you are scaling up, you can scale up, by 10, 15. So you can have something in the community for 5 or 10. You can have something for 100 as well. What is important is to have a base, and 60 is a good base, and then you can build on top of that. So you can even have something specific, because you use the same power purchase agreement, you have the same off-takers, so it's easier to replicate.
What challenges do you anticipate as you carry on this endeavor to support the development of renewable energy projects across the continent?
Everybody needs renewable energy, and everybody sees the potential for renewable energy. So renewable energy is a combination of solar, wind, and hydro. And hydro is a bit more prevalent because it was the first technology that was available. And we see opportunities to upgrade a lot of those existing plants with new turbines. There are also opportunities to build new ones. So, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, we're building the first private sector led hydro power plant. and it reduces the tariffs in the country significantly. So we're working with the government to do that, and we see opportunities to rehabilitate other hydro dams, as well as we see opportunities for wind farms and solar plants across the country, across the continent. And we have several pipelines projects. So if you recall, last year we acquired Lekela, which is the largest renewable energy asset on the continent, with wind farms and solar in Senegal, in Egypt, and South Africa. Ourselves, we have a platform that is wind, solar and hydro, and we're growing that to 3 gigawatts. Just demonstrates the potential on the continent and the need and eagerness, for us to continue to build out renewable energy. What is also important, like I mentioned earlier, is the need to have green economies, green industrial parks, focusing on processing the minerals and metals that are required, for the energy transition in a sustainable way. We have a project now, in fact, recently at an investment committee, we're talking about putting in a smelter, to convert copper to anode. And the energy that will be required for that is going to be hydro powered. And what we're doing is to support the financing of the rehabilitation of an existing hydro dam, expand the capacity, and that energy will be used, to produce anode. So it's also important that as we look at transition, we use renewable energy for the transition, as opposed to using more fossil fuel to produce renewable energy components. In Africa, we have the opportunity to significantly use renewable energy to process and provide the minerals and metals that are required for green economy and for net zero.
Okay, we'll have to leave the conversation there. Samaila Zubairu, President of the Africa Finance Corporation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Now heading back to the Kenyan capital, and just across town from the grand discussions at the climate summit, a more modest initiative is attempting to help make the city more livable. See, Nairobi is growing fast, and so too is the waste it produces, and it's struggling to manage and recycle it adequately. But as DW's Felix Moringa reports, some Nairobians think all hope is not lost.
This is Kariobangi's First People's Park, a green oasis in one of Kenya's informal settlements within the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. For a few years now, team members from Com Green Solutions have been planting trees and grasses, including bamboo, which absorb more carbon and releases more oxygen than many other plants. Esther is one of the 15 women on the team who have helped to transform this area.
I feel poor and proud.
I feel really good, and I'm proud because the park is communal. We have put in effort to ensure the community can enjoy clean air and relax here.
Com Green Solutions is a youth-led movement trying to grow awareness of the climate crisis. They've turned the site into a new green space for everyone to enjoy. Young people are key stakeholders in climate action. With about 63% of Africa's population being young, the Com Green team here is leveraging on passion, innovation, and constant progress to create a greener and sustainable future. It is a transformation that is still happening. The project is on the banks of the Nairobi River, though along much of its course, neither water nor the shores are visible. The river is choked up with heaps of trash and clogged with plastic waste that comes from the industries along the river, homesteads, and illegal dumping of waste into the river. Despite the tons of trash looming over their lives, the group has set up a green farm, including poultry, and runs a green mentorship program.
We are not greening the environment for us, but for the next generation, so that they do not find an unconducive environment. We want to create a better environment for them and show them this is the way of doing things.
The plan is to involve local children so they can learn about their environment. And they are building a community kitchen where people will be able to cook some of the produce now being grown in the area.